There is a saying among the older instructors at the Interstellar Defense Academy, whispered in the mess halls, and repeated in hushed tones by cadets who were not even there to see it happen. Never let a human volunteer for anything. The cadets who heard that saying for the first time always laughed. They stopped laughing after they learned why. The story starts on a gray morning in the third training cycle, in a lecture hall built for bodies far larger than the ones sitting in it that day. The academy sat on a moon called Varen's Station, a joint installation carved into rock and reinforced with alloys from 6 different worlds, where the sons and daughters of a dozen species came to learn how to fight wars that hadn't happened yet. It was supposed to be the great equalizer, species from across the Alliance side by side, learning the same doctrine, held to the same standard. In practice, it was anything but equal. Humanity had joined the Alliance only 11 years earlier, a blink of an eye by the standards of species who had been navigating the stars for millennia. The other delegations still treated human cadets the way an older sibling treats a toddler who insists on carrying the groceries. Polite, indulgent, faintly amused. Nobody said it to their faces, not officially, but the attitude lived in every raised eyebrow, every exchanged glance, every time a human cadet was assigned to the auxiliary support track instead of combat certification. Cadet Mireille Okafor did not attend the academy trailing rumors of greatness. She was 22 years old, quiet almost to the point of invisibility, and she carried herself like someone who had learned a long time ago that saying less meant being underestimated less loudly. She sat in the back row of every lecture hall she entered. She turned in her coursework early and never asked for extensions. When other cadets debated tactics in the commons at night, voices rising with the confidence of youth, she mostly listened. Her instructor's notes on her, if anyone had bothered to read them closely, told a different story than the one her silence suggested. Top scores in structural engineering, top scores in applied physics, a disciplinary record clean as glass. But numbers on a page rarely change first impressions, and the first impression most of the academy had of humans was built entirely around one thing: bodies. Human bodies. Next to the frames of the other species enrolled at Varen's Station, looked almost fragile. The Draventh cadets stood 2.5 meters tall with exoskeletal plating along their forearms. The Solace hailed from a world with gravity nearly double standard, and their cadets could bend reinforced steel bars as a warm-up exercise. Even the willowy, quick-tempered Akari, built for speed rather than power, could outrun any human sprinter without breaking a real sweat. Next to them, humans looked like they were made of paper and good intentions. That perception had a name, and the name was Instructor Cavril Das. Cavril Das taught applied xenophysiology, a required course for every second cycle cadet, regardless of species. And he had built something of a reputation for himself over the years. Not for his research, though. He had done plenty of it. Not for his teaching methods, though those were rigorous enough. Das was known, quietly and almost affectionately, by cadets who weren't the target of it, for his opinions. He was Draventh himself, built like a monument, with plated gray skin that caught the light like polished stone, and a voice that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the floor. He had served in 3 border conflicts before retiring to teach, and he wore that service like a badge that excused him from having to soften anything he said. He did not believe in coddling cadets with comfortable lies about equality. He believed in data, and in his considerable experience, the data on humans was not flattering. That gray morning, he stood at the front of the lecture hall with a projection hovering behind him, a rotating model of a human skeletal structure next to a Draventh one, the human frame looking almost comically delicate beside its counterpart. He began the way he always began, without warmth, without preamble. Today we examine load-bearing capacity across allied species physiology, he said, his voice rolling out over the rows of cadets like distant thunder. This is not merely academic. In combat, in disaster response, in any scenario requiring you to move mass under duress, your species' baseline capability determines your role. It determines what you can be trusted with, and it determines, frankly, what will get you and your unit killed if you overestimate yourselves. He gestured to the projection, and the human skeleton rotated slowly, spotlighted, isolated from the others like a specimen under glass. Homo sapiens, he said, represent the least physically capable species currently enrolled at this academy. A ripple went through the room. Not shock, exactly. More like recognition. Like hearing out loud something everyone already assumed but rarely said in a lecture hall with the lights up. Dawes continued, unbothered, scrolling through data on muscle density, bone tensile strength, joint load limits. He compared average human deadlift capacity to Solisk. He compared human sprint speed to Akari. He compared human bone fracture thresholds to Draventh plating, and the numbers, presented in his flat and clinical tone, made humans look less like soldiers and more like something that needed to be protected from the battlefield rather than deployed onto it. "I want to be clear," Dawes said. And here, his voice took on the particular weight of a man who believed he was being generous. "This is not an insult. It is a fact of biology. Humans evolved on a world with gentler gravity, softer terrain, fewer large predators in their recent evolutionary history. There is no shame in the limitation, but there is shame, cadets, in refusing to acknowledge it. A soldier who does not know their own limits is a soldier who gets their unit killed." He looked out over the rows of faces, Draventh nodding along in solemn agreement, Solace cadets exchanging small, knowing smirks, Akari cadets already losing interest in doodling on their batapads. "No human physiology," Dawes said, delivering what he clearly considered the thesis of the lecture, the line he had probably delivered a dozen times to a dozen different cohorts, "could survive prolonged exposure to a gravity well even 20% above Earth standard without catastrophic structural failure. It is simply not built for it. No amount of training changes the architecture. You were born with," he said it the way a man states the boiling point of water, not cruelly, just certainly, as though he were doing the human cadets a favor by telling them plainly what their bodies could never do, so they wouldn't waste their lives finding out the hard way. In the back row, near the wall, Mireille Okafor sat very still. She had heard versions of this lecture before, in other classes, from other instructors, phrased with slightly more diplomacy, but carrying the exact same conclusion. She had absorbed 1,000 small comments over her time at the academy, the surprised tone when she scored well on a physical evaluation, the way senior officers' eyes slid past human cadets when assigning heavy labor drills, the assumption, baked so deep into the culture of the place that nobody even noticed they were making it, that human meant weak. She had let it go, every time. She had told herself it didn't matter what people assumed, because the work would speak for itself eventually. That had been her philosophy since she was a girl growing up in a coastal town in what used to be called West Africa, in a family of dock workers and welders and women who lifted things for a living and never once complained about it. "Let your hands do the talking." Her grandmother used to say that, standing waist-deep in the business of hauling nets that weighed more than she did, laughing at anyone who assumed her small frame meant small strength. Mireille had carried that lesson all the way to the stars. But something about the word catastrophic, delivered so casually, so certainly, in front of an entire lecture hall of cadets who would go on to serve beside her, command alongside her, decide in the field whether or not to trust her with a task that mattered, snagged on something in her chest and would not let go. A Draventh cadet, 2 rows ahead of her, a broad-shouldered young man named Tarn, who Mireille had exchanged maybe a dozen words with in the entire cycle, turned around and looked at her with what might have been an attempt at kindness. "No offense," he said, in the particular tone people use right before they say something offensive. "But he's not wrong. My cousin served with a human unit on a relief mission. Nice people. But you basically have to build ramps for everything. Doorways, cargo lifts, all of it." A few cadets nearby laughed, not cruelly, just easily. The way people laugh at something they've decided is simply true. Dawes, hearing the murmur, glanced up from his notes with the mild irritation of a man who did not appreciate his lecture being interrupted, even by agreement. "Is there a question?" he asked. Mireille realized distantly that every eye in the vicinity had turned toward her. She hadn't raised her hand. She hadn't said a word. But something in her posture, some shift she hadn't consciously chosen, had drawn attention, the way a held breath draws attention in a silent room. She stood up. It was a small thing, the standing. But the lecture hall's seating was tiered, and human cadets were seated toward the back specifically because their smaller frames didn't obstruct the sight lines of the larger species behind them, a piece of unconscious accommodation nobody had ever questioned. Standing up meant every cadet below her, tier after tier, had to turn and look up to see her. "I have a question," Myra said. Her voice was quiet, it always was, but the room had gone quiet enough to carry it. Das regarded her with the patient, faintly weary expression of an instructor who had answered 1,000 student challenges over the years and expected this to be exactly like all the others. "Go ahead, cadet. You said no human physiology could survive prolonged exposure to a gravity well 20% above standard without catastrophic failure," Muriel said. "Is that specifically about survival, or is it also a claim about functional strength under those conditions?" "Both," Das said. "They are related metrics. A structure that cannot bear load will fail before it has the chance to demonstrate anything else." "And the data you showed us," Muriel said, nodding toward the still-rotating skeletal projection. "That's baseline. Untrained civilian averages, mostly. Am I reading that right?" Something flickered across Doss's stone-gray features, something that might have been the first hint of irritation at being questioned on his own numbers. "The data accounts for statistical variance across trained and untrained populations," he said. "The conclusions do not meaningfully change at the extremes. Even your most decorated human special forces operators fall dramatically short of baseline capability in other species. This is not controversial among xenophysiologists, cadet. I would be doing you a disservice to pretend otherwise." "I understand," Muriel said. "I just think it might be worth testing directly, rather than extrapolating from a chart." The room made a sound. Not quite a laugh, more like the intake of breath right before one. Doss tilted his massive head slightly. The closest his rigid features came to raising an eyebrow. "You wish to demonstrate a counterexample. I'd like to try, sir, if that's permitted." There was a long pause. Doss glanced at the projection behind him, at the rows of cadets watching now with real interest. The Solace cadets in particular sitting up a little straighter, sensing entertainment. He could have said no. He could have moved on with his lecture and let the moment dissolve into nothing, the way these moments usually did. But Kavril Das had spent 30 years believing certain things about the universe, and 30 years of being right about them had made him careless about the possibility of being wrong. "Very well," he said. "Have. The training annex is equipped with a calibrated resistance rig designed to simulate gravitational loading up to 3 times Earth standard. If you wish to demonstrate functional strength under duress, I will permit a brief practical exercise immediately following this lecture. The entire cohort may observe." It was meant, Mireille understood, as a lesson. A public one. The kind that would settle the matter so thoroughly that no cadet in this cohort would ever again waste class time questioning established data. "Thank you, sir," Mireille said, and sat back down. The rest of the lecture passed in a strange, charged quiet. Cadets no longer quite listening to Doss's follow-up remarks on tendon elasticity across species, their attention instead drifting again and again to the small, still woman in the back row who had just volunteered to publicly prove an instructor wrong in front of the entire second cycle cohort. 2. Bird moved fast in a building full of bored, socially starved cadets. By the time the lecture ended, the training annex, a cavernous space 3 levels down with reinforced flooring and a resistance rig bolted into the center of it like some ancient torture device reimagined for pedagogical purposes, had already begun filling with cadets from other sections. Someone had messaged someone that someone had messaged 3 more people. Within 20 minutes, nearly the entire second cycle cohort, close to 400 cadets from 11 different species, had crowded into the annex, murmuring, placing quiet bets, watching the door. Mireille arrived with her uniform still buttoned to regulation, her expression unreadable, walking the way she always walked, unhurried, economical, betraying nothing. The rig itself was an ugly, functional piece of engineering. a circular platform surrounded by a ring of gravitic emitters, capable of simulating localized gravity fields far beyond what any training room needed to replicate for ordinary purposes, built originally to prepare cadets for deployment on high-gravity worlds. Bolted to the center of the platform was a solid alloy bar, roughly the length of a person, connected on either end to a resistance column that measured, in real time, the exact force applied against it. It was normally used to test grip strength and pull capacity under simulated conditions. It had never, as far as anyone present could recall, been used quite the way it was about to be used. Das stood at the control console beside the rig, his massive frame looking almost bored, almost disappointed, the posture of a man going through the motions of a demonstration whose outcome he had already decided. "The standard test," he announced to the gathered cohort, his voice carrying easily over the murmuring crowd, "measures maximum controlled lift capacity under increasing simulated gravity. Cadets are asked to raise the resistance bar from its resting position to full extension. We will begin at Earth standard to establish baseline and increase incrementally." He turned to Mireille. "Are you prepared, cadet?" "Yes, sir." She stepped onto the platform beside the resistance bar. Her frame did look small, exactly as Doss's charts had suggested it would, exactly as every cadet in that crowd had been trained by a decade of quiet cultural assumption to expect. A Salisk cadet near the front. Easily 2 meters of dense, corded muscle built for a world twice Earth's gravity, folded his arms and watched with an expression of polite anticipation, the look of someone waiting for a foregone conclusion to arrive on schedule. The gravity emitters hummed to life. The platform's readout ticked over to 1 standard gravity. Mireille gripped the bar. At Earth standard, the lift was almost unremarkable. She raised it smoothly, controlled, the resistance column ticking off a number that drew a few polite nods, but no particular reaction. It was, after all, only baseline. Any of the larger species present could have lifted triple that without strain. Increasing to 1.5 standard, Das said, adjusting the console. The hum deepened. Muriel's stance shifted, her weight settling lower, her breathing audibly changing, but she raised the bar again. Slower this time, her forearms visibly tensing, the tendons along her neck standing out with effort. The resistance column's number climbed. A murmur moved through the crowd, not impressed, exactly surprised. Maybe the way people are surprised when something performs slightly better than the low bar they'd set for it. 2 standard, Das said. This was the point. Everyone in the room understood without being told, at which the exercise was supposed to end. 2 standard gravity was already at the outer edge of what Doss's lecture had described as survivable strain for unmodified human physiology under sustained load. It was, by his own numbers, presented not 20 minutes earlier, close to the threshold of catastrophic structural failure. Mireille planted her feet. The gravity field thickened around the platform, a visible shimmer in the air, the kind of distortion that made everyone standing near the perimeter feel their own bones settle a little heavier in their bodies even outside the rig's direct radius. Muriel's face tightened. A thin line of sweat broke along her hairline. But her hands did not loosen on the bar. She lifted it. It came slower than before, a long, grinding, visible effort, her arms trembling with the strain, every watching cadet leaning forward now. The murmuring stopped entirely, replaced by a silence dense enough to match the gravity in the room. The resistance column ticked over, number climbing steadily, and when the bar reached full extension, a ragged breath tore out of her, and she held it there, actually held it. Locked at the top of the lift, arms shaking. At twice the gravitational load her own instructor had insisted her species could not endure without breaking. Doss's expression did not change immediately. It took him a moment, the console readout blinking patiently in front of him, before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "That is an unusually high result for baseline human physiology," he said. "Impressive, cadet, but we are only at 2 standard. The claim in question concerns sustained exposure at levels beyond that." Mireille lowered the bar, breathing hard, and looked at him. "Then let's find out," she said. There was something in the way she said it. Not a challenge exactly, not defiance either. Just a flat, quiet certainty that made several cadets in the crowd shift uncomfortably, as though they'd just realized they were watching something they hadn't expected to be watching. Das hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely visible, the kind of pause a proud man allows himself before doing something he has already decided he cannot back out of without losing considerably more than he stands to gain. 400 cadets were watching, his own thesis, delivered not an hour earlier, with total confidence. Hung in the room like a held breath. 2.5 standard, he said. The gravity field deepened again, and this time the change in the room itself was visible. Dust motes on the floor flattening the fabric of cadets' uniforms hanging heavier, a few of the smaller Ahari cadets near the platform's edge audibly grunting at the increased ambient pull even outside the rig's direct focus. Mireille gripped the bar again. Her whole body seemed to compress under the effort, shoulders driving down, legs locking, the muscles along her forearms standing out in sharp, defined ridges that made the polite skepticism on the Solace cadet's face falter into something more like genuine attention. She did not lift the bar quickly. It came up in agonizing increments, the resistance column's numbers climbing in fits and starts, a sound tearing out of her that was somewhere between a grunt and a growl, low and controlled. The sound of someone who had done hard, physical, unglamorous labor her whole life and knew exactly how to breathe through pain instead of around it. The bar reached full extension. She held it. Note: for 3 full seconds, she held it at 2.5 times Earth's gravity, a load that Doss's own lecture delivered less than an hour prior had characterized as producing catastrophic structural failure in unmodified human physiology. Her arm shook. Sweat ran freely down her face, now dripping onto the platform. But nothing failed, no bone cracked, no tendon snapped. She stood there, small and shaking and absolutely upright, holding a bar that should have broken her, according to every chart Doss had shown the room that morning. Then, with visible, deliberate control, she lowered it and stepped back and let out a long breath that fogged faintly in the suddenly much colder air near the platform's edge, an atmospheric side effect of the intense gravitic field. The silence that followed was total. It was Tarn, the Draventh cadet, who had turned around in the lecture hall to tell her, with gentle condescension, that she probably needed ramps built for her, who finally spoke, his voice carrying an entirely different quality than it had that morning. "That's not possible," he said, not accusingly, but with the tone of someone whose entire framework for understanding the universe had just developed a small, persistent crack. The charts, the bone density projections. That should not have been possible. "Perhaps the charts are incomplete," Mireille said quietly, still catching her breath. Doss stood at the console, staring at the readout, at the numbers his own equipment had recorded, numbers that directly contradicted the lecture he had delivered to this exact cohort, not 90 minutes earlier. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and in that silence, something shifted in the room, a recalibration happening in real time, behind 400 pairs of watching eyes. "There are individual outliers in every population," Doss finally said, and there was a defensiveness in his voice now that hadn't been there before, the sound of a man reaching for the nearest available explanation, rather than sitting with an uncomfortable new truth. "Genetic exceptions. This does not overturn a body of established research, cadet. One data point is an anomaly, not a pattern." "Then let's establish a pattern," Mireille said. "Run it again. 3. Standard this time." A ripple of alarm moved through the crowd at that, several cadets glancing at each other, because 3 times Earth's gravity was not a number anyone treated casually. Not even the Solace cadets built for heavy worlds, whose own baseline physiology was calibrated for roughly 2 standard gravities, and who found 3 punishing even with their reinforced skeletal structure. "Cadet," Doss said, and for the first time that morning there was something in his voice that might have been actual concern rather than simple professional skepticism. 3 standard gravity carries real risk, regardless of species. I would be negligent to permit this without medical staff present." "Then call medical staff," Mireille said. "I'll wait." It took 11 minutes for a medical technician to arrive from the infirmary 2 levels up. a lean, quick-moving Akari named Fessa, who took one look at the gathered crowd, at the resistance rig, at the utterly still human cadet standing at its center, and asked exactly one question before setting up her monitoring equipment. Is this the one they've been messaging about? Nobody bothered to answer her. She already knew. With medical monitoring in place, sensors attached along Mireille's forearms and collarbone to track bone stress and cardiac strain in real time, DOS reluctantly increased the gravity field to 3 standard. The change in the room was immediate and dramatic. Several cadets near the platform's edge staggered, caught off guard by the field's bleed radius, and a Draventh instructor's aide, who had wandered in to see what the commotion was about, grunted audibly and widened his stance to keep his footing. 3 times Earth's gravity was not a subtle thing. It pressed down on everything in the room like an invisible tide, and even the sturdiest species present felt it in their bones. Mireille gripped the bar. This time, there was no pretense of ease. Her whole body shook with the effort. Before she had even begun to lift, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts, her eyes fixed on some point past the bar entirely. The look of someone who had gone somewhere else in her mind, someplace built specifically for enduring exactly this kind of pain. The bar did not move for nearly 5 full seconds. Then, impossibly, it began to rise. The medical technician's monitoring equipment beeped steadily, tracking bone stress levels climbing toward thresholds that, on paper, should have already produced fracturing. They did not fracture. Muriel's tendons stood out along her arms like cables pulled taut, her jaw locked, a low, continuous sound tearing out from somewhere deep in her chest. But the bar kept rising, inch by grinding inch. The resistance column's readout, climbing to numbers that made the console itself flash a warning indicator DOS had genuinely never seen triggered before in his 30 years of teaching this course. The bar reached full extension. She did not hold it for 3 seconds this time. She held it for 11. Nobody in that room breathed for the entirety of those 11 seconds. 400 cadets from 11 different species stood in absolute silence, watching a single human woman defy a chart that every one of them had been shown as unshakable scientific fact not 2 hours earlier, watching numbers on a console climb into territory that Instructor Cavril DOS, standing rigid and pale gray at his post, had told them was biologically impossible. When she finally lowered the bar and stepped back, her legs gave out, not from injury. The medical technician confirmed it immediately, running her hands briskly over Mireille's collarbone and forearms, checking the sensor readouts with quick practice motions. Simple exhaustion, muscular fatigue, nothing broken, nothing torn. A body that had been pushed to its absolute limit and had, against every prediction in the room, held. 2 Draventh cadets rushed forward to help her to a bench along the wall, their earlier condescension entirely evaporated, replaced now by something that looked distinctly like awe. Someone produced a water pouch. Someone else, a young Solus cadet who had spent the entire lecture hall discussion smirking quietly at the back of the room, simply stood staring at the console readout, mouthing the numbers to himself as though repetition might make them make sense. DOS approached slowly, his massive frame moving, with none of its earlier certainty. He looked at the readout. He looked at Mireille, pale and shaking and utterly upright on the bench, sipping water with hands that would not quite stop trembling. He looked for a long moment like a man doing very difficult arithmetic in his head. That, he finally said, should not have been possible. You said that already, Mireille answered, and there was no triumph in her voice, no bitterness either, just simple, tired fact. Twice, actually. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, nervous and relieved, the kind of laughter that happens after a long-held breath finally gets released. DOS did not laugh. He crouched, bringing his massive frame down to something closer to her eye level, an unusual posture for a man who had spent 30 years standing over cadets rather than beside them. I would like to understand this, he said, and his voice had changed entirely now. The certainty of the lecture hall replaced by something that sounded for the first time like actual scientific curiosity rather than settled conviction. Your bone density readings are unremarkable for baseline human physiology. Your muscle mass is unremarkable. By every metric I possess, you should not have been able to complete that lift, let alone sustain it." Mireille considered the question for a moment, still catching her breath. And when she answered, it was not with data or physiology, but with something simpler. "My grandmother hauled fishing nets for 40 years, she said. Nets that weighed more than she did. Every morning, rain or wind or nothing at all, she'd stand on those docks and pull, because if she didn't, her family didn't eat that week. Nobody ever told her she wasn't built for it. She just did it because it needed doing. And she found out somewhere along the way that the body does an awful lot of things it's not supposed to be able to do if the reason is good enough." She looked at the console, at the numbers still glowing on the readout. "You built your chart from average people doing an average day," she said. "You never charted what happens when it matters." The room was very quiet after that. Doss straightened slowly, looking at the readout again, and then at the assembled crowd of cadets, all of whom were watching him, now waiting to see what a man who had built 30 years of professional identity around a claim would do now that the claim had just been publicly, undeniably broken in front of him. To his credit, and it was a credit history would remember him for, he did not retreat into excuses. "I owe this cohort a correction," he said, turning to address the entire crowd, his voice carrying the same authority it always had, but shaped now around a very different conclusion. "The data I presented this morning was accurate as far as it went. It was also incomplete, and I presented it with a certainty the evidence did not actually support. Physical capability under extreme duress cannot be fully predicted by baseline measurements alone. There are variables, will chief among them, that our current models do not adequately capture." He looked at Mireille. "I will be revising this course's material," he said, "and I will be doing so with your permission to cite today's demonstration, cadet, if you're willing to give it." "You don't need my permission to tell the truth," Mireille said. "But yes, you can cite it." By the time evening mess opened that day, the story had already outpaced any official account of it. It moved through the academy the way stories do among the young and impressionable gathering, small exaggerations with each retelling, the 11 seconds becoming 15 in one version, becoming a full 30 in another, told by a particularly enthusiastic Akari cadet, 3 tables down from where it actually happened. By the time it reached the 4th cycle cadets, senior students who rarely paid attention to anything involving 2nd cycle underclassmen, the story had transformed into something closer to legend. The human who broke the gravity rig. The quiet one who stood up. Cadets who had never spoken 2 words to Mireille found reasons to nod at her in the corridors. The solace cadet who had smirked through the lecture found her in the mess hall that evening, and with the particular awkward formality of someone unaccustomed to admitting fault, apologized for his assumptions and asked with genuine curiosity rather than mockery this time, how she had trained for something like that. "I didn't train for that specifically," Mireille told him. "I trained the way I always have, hard and often, and without excuses. The rest just showed up when it needed to." Tarn, the Draventh cadet who had told her that morning she needed ramps built, found her later that night in the training annex alone, working through a much gentler routine on the same rig that had made her a legend hours earlier. "I owe you an apology," he said, standing at a respectful distance, his earlier easy condescension nowhere to be found. "What I said this morning, it was thoughtless. It was honest," Mireille said, not looking up from her work. "You said what everyone here thinks and nobody here says out loud. I'd rather have honest than polite." "Still," Tarn said, "I was wrong." "You were repeating a chart," Mireille said. "The chart was wrong." "That's different from you being a bad person. Just means you've got some updating to do." He considered that for a long moment, and then, in a gesture that would itself become a small part of the story, cadets told each other over the following weeks. He sat down on the bench beside the rig, uninvited but not unwelcome, and asked her to show him the lift, not to compete with it. He made that clear immediately, and Mireille appreciated the honesty of it, because a cadet built like a small mountain, trying to prove himself against her that night, would have curdled the whole moment into something ugly and competitive that neither of them wanted. He simply wanted to understand the mechanics of what she'd done. The breathing, the stance, the particular quality of will that had let a body built for gentler gravity hold steady against numbers that should have broken it. She showed him. Took the better part of an hour, and by the end of it, something had shifted between them that neither of them bothered naming out loud, but which both of them recognized as the beginning of something like genuine respect, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Instructor Doss did not sleep well that night, and he would tell colleagues years later, at conferences and in academic papers that cited a certain unusual case study from his time teaching at Varen Station, that it was the best professionally uncomfortable night of his career. He spent it revising his lecture notes, cross-referencing decades of physiological data against a new variable he had never adequately weighted before. Not genetics, not training regimen though, that mattered too. Something harder to quantify and impossible to ignore once you had seen it demonstrated in front of 400 witnesses. He revised the course. DC order of that revision spread almost as fast as the story of the lift itself, because instructors at the academy did not, as a rule, publicly rewrite their own curriculum in response to a single second cycle cadets demonstration. And the fact that Doss did exactly that lent the whole event a kind of institutional permanence it might not have otherwise earned. The updated lecture delivered to the next cohort of second cycle cadets 3 weeks later no longer contained the phrase catastrophic structural failure attached to human physiology without significant qualification. It contained instead a recorded clip of the resistance rig readout, time-stamped and verified, alongside a new section on what Doss began calling, somewhat sheepishly, the will variable. Myrail did not become someone who sought out the attention that followed. She remained, in most visible ways, exactly the cadet she had always been, quiet in lecture halls, early with her coursework, unhurried in the corridors. But something had changed in how the academy moved around her. Instructors who had once assigned her to auxiliary support tracks without a second thought began, cautiously at first, and then without hesitation, considering her for assignments that actually tested what she was capable of. Cadets from species that had spent a decade treating human enrollment as a diplomatic courtesy rather than a genuine addition to their ranks began one at a time, adjusting the shape of their assumptions. It did not fix everything. Old habits of thought rarely die all at once, and there were still instructors at Varen Station who found ways to keep believing what they had always believed, filing Mirai's demonstration away as an outlier rather than a correction. Exactly the defense Doss himself had reached for in that first stunned minute before he'd found the courage to abandon it. But something had cracked permanently in the quiet certainty that had governed how humans were perceived at that academy, and cracks like that have a way of spreading, whether the people who'd rather they didn't like it or not. Months later, when Myrail graduated into full combat certification, the ceremony was attended by cadets from every delegation at the academy, many of whom had not been there the day of the demonstration, but had heard the story so many times it had become part of the institutional folklore anyway. The kind of story new cadets got told during their first week, half warning and half welcome. Instructor Doss stood among the faculty that day, and when her name was called, he was the one who stepped forward to present her certification, a small, deliberate gesture that everyone in that hall understood the weight of. "There is a lesson in this cadet's record," he told the assembled graduates, his voice carrying the same authority it always had, shaped now around a very different conviction than the one he'd walked into that lecture hall with 11 months earlier. It is not that humans are equal to other species in every measurable way. Equality of that kind is a fiction, and any instructor who tells you otherwise is lying to make you comfortable. The lesson is that measurement itself has limits, and the moment you mistake your chart for the whole truth of a person standing in front of you, you have already made your first serious error as an officer. He looked at Mirai, standing straight and steady in her new uniform, exactly as quiet and exactly as unassuming as she had been the day she stood up in the back row of his lecture hall and asked a simple question that changed the way an entire academy thought about what a body could do when the reason was good enough. "Never assume you have seen the limit of what someone can do," Doss said, "until you have watched them decide it matters enough to find out." Somewhere out past the training annex, past the mess halls and the dormitories and the long gray corridors of Varen Station, The story of the quiet cadet who broke the gravity rig kept traveling the way good stories do, carried forward by cadets who would themselves become instructors one day. Who would tell it to rooms full of new arrivals, still nursing their own quiet assumptions about who belonged, where, and who could be trusted with what. It never grew less true in the retelling. Even as the details shifted and softened with time, it only grew more necessary. Thanks for watching. If this story hit you the way it hit me writing it, go ahead and leave a like, drop a comment about your favorite moment, and subscribe if you want more stories about quiet strength proving loud arrogance wrong. Let me know what you thought of Doss's turnaround in the comments below. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars and never underestimate the quiet ones in the back row.